Welcome back. Episode 7. We are getting there. We're almost to the end. This thing is really starting to look like a guitar. It's starting to feel like a guitar. And this is the next to last episode. If you remember, in the previous episode, we very carefully measured for the bridge, drilled the holes for the mounting, and then we came back and we drilled for the ferrules. Today's episode is really all about the cavities. We're gonna route for the pickup cavities. We're using Filtertrons on this, and then we're gonna locate and route the pocket for the electronics. Now normally on a Telecaster, there's a pick guard and a plate here, and all the electronics mount from the front. But we're gonna come in from the back, and we're gonna drill through for the tone control and the volume knob, and put the switch through, much like what we had in our original picture way back in the beginning. What we're building is a very nice representation of this, and let's get going. Let's start with routing the pickup cavities. While the bridge was still on, I made a mark from the front of the bridge and then a nice crisp center line to help me line up the pickup template that I'll use to route the pockets. Now, you can find Filtertron routing templates online, but in this case, I decided to make my own. The reason being, as I mentioned in earlier episodes, we're eventually going to show you how to put an oil finish on this guitar. So unlike a film finish like nitro or catalyzed urethane or poly that are thicker, oil finishes are very thin. So I made this template a little tighter than the standard to account for that. Now, the question is, where should you route the pickup locations? And the answer for that is, it depends. It depends on what kind of bridge you used, what kind of pickups you used. So in this particular case, we're gonna go 1 15/16 from the front of the bridge to the front of our pickup location. And we're gonna go 6 1/4 inches from the front of the bridge to the front of the neck position. That's just because of the bridge I chose. That's just because of these pickups. Your mileage may vary. So to get going, we need to affix our template to the guitar with some double-sided tape. Okay, now, again, I've made a line that is exactly where the front of the pickup cavity should go, and we're going to align that with the front edge of our routing template, and then I've put center line marks on the template, which will help align everything so everything stays nice and square. Lightly set it in place before you lock it down, just to make sure you're exactly where you want to be, and then check everything carefully. If you've got an Optivisor, now's a good time to use it. You got a little wiggle room with the tape before you press it down. Okay, and once you get it exactly where you want it, just lock your tape down. Once that's in place, we're gonna move to the router. Now, TV Jones says for their pickup depths to do 5/8 of an inch deep for the neck, 3/4 of an inch deep for the bridge. But I'm gonna route them both to 3/4 of an inch. It doesn't really matter, it just gives you a little extra room for height adjustment if you make them a little deeper. To route these pockets, I've taken the router and I've set it up with a bit that has a bearing guide on it, and that bearing is going to actually ride on the inside edge of our template. Now when it comes to choosing a bit, I've chosen a relatively small bit that'll give me a shallow depth of cut. Starting small gives me more control over the depth of the cut, allowing me to slowly shave away the material until I hit 3/4 of an inch depth, versus choosing a bit that's too long and accidentally cutting too deep right out of the gate. Okay, so before I turn this on, I'm gonna get everything else off this table because everything's gonna be covered in dust by the time I'm done. Put on my glasses and away we go. Now when I actually turn this on, I'm gonna hold this up and I'm gonna sit it down like this into the middle. Don't try to come in on your template because you're gonna hit your template and you're gonna ruin it. So secure this nice and firm and then plunge in like this. And then just go nice and slow once you're in there. There's no big hurry. Okay, that's our first cut. We'll clean that up, plunge and do it again. This is as deep as we can go with this bit, and we're not 3/4 of an inch down yet. So we can either continue to use our template and we can use a longer bit, or we can take this off and then try to use this bit and use the actual guitar face as the template. Now, I'm gonna use a slightly longer bit because I'm afraid if I use this bit on the guitar face that we're actually gonna be deeper than 3/4 of an inch. So let me get the other bit, we'll set that up and we'll be ready to go. Yep, that'll do it. Okay, let's pop the template off. Slow and steady. Don't run this thing through your hand. Okay, excellent. So we are just about 3/4. Just about where we want to be. So let's move on to the next one. I like to keep this cleaned up so I can see what I'm doing. Because this bit is almost the same size as the template, I need to check it very carefully to make sure it doesn't actually touch the template. Okay, let's see how we did here. There we go, 3/4 of an inch, boom. Okay, we're set. The pickup cavities are routed. Okay, so after you've gone through all that work, right, the next thing you have to do is you have to put the pickups in the cavities to see if they fit right. So let's give that a shot and see how they fit. Let's start with the bridge pickup. Get our wires down in there. Oh yeah, that looks great. Nice and tight. Just check the bridge. And there we go. So they're snug. I mean, and I wanted them snug. There's just enough space in there to account for the thin oil finish. Now let's move on to route for the control cavity on the back. Stylistically, I've decided to create a cover for this pocket that'll mount flush with the back of the guitar, so it actually looks like the back of the guitar. To make the cover, I'm going to use one of the cutoffs from this piece of rosewood, which matches perfectly. It'll just look like another part of the rosewood. To help me execute these cuts correctly, I have made up this jig that will essentially allow me to cut the electronics pocket and then a little shelf that goes all the way around it where the cover plate will recess down into the back. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, I don't have one of these templates. Where do I get one of these templates? If you make guitars, you're gonna make jigs. For this one, I used the traditional cavity shape of a Telecaster as my template, but really, you can use any shape you want. I cut this on a CNC machine. We'll put a link to the files. So if you want to cut one like this yourself, great, you might have access to a makerspace, or you might have your own small CNC machine. If you don't, this is still a pretty easy project just using, just regular tools. So we're gonna start by double stick taping this jig into place on the guitar. Now that this is stuck down nice and tight, we're gonna take a Forstner bit over to the drill press. And we're going to very carefully drill out a whole bunch of this material that goes down pretty far into the cavity. Let's get the drill press set up. We're gonna set the stop on the drill press to really do two things. We'll set the height of the bit with a little room to spare to make sure that A, we don't accidentally drill through the guitar, and B, there's a spike at the bottom of this bit that's gonna make a little hole at the bottom as we cut. So that extra room will allow us to come back later with a router and clean up the little holes that makes. So when we're all done, we have a smooth pocket at the bottom of the control cavity. The second thing we want from the drill press setup is to ensure all the holes are about at the same depth. To do that, we set the stop on the drill press to lock it into place. All right, I'm ready to drill. I've clamped this down to the bench just to make sure nothing moves, and let's start drilling our first hole. Okay, this turned out really well. The drill press did the bulk of the work. Now, let's get out the router to clean up these edges. If you'll notice, these are the little holes that I mentioned at the bottom. The router will smooth those out too and get us down to our final depth. Let's do this. It's like snow. Okay, the edges and the bottom are smoothed out and looking really good, but I'm still short depth-wise. So to reach our max depth, I swapped this bit out for a longer one to creep down on it to hit our final depth. That's about as deep as I can go without removing the template. But before I take this template off and bring it down to final depth, I'm gonna go ahead and route for the cover plate. I put a new bit in the trimmer with a very short cutter. And again, we're gonna use this piece of rosewood. So I set the depth of the cutter to be just a shade less than the piece of rosewood, because we'll ultimately sand that down to fit, and that should be just about perfect. Now we've routed for the cover plate. I'll go ahead and pop this template off. Just get some of this tape residue off with a little bit of naphtha. So what we're gonna do now is that we are just gonna creep down this cavity until we start to see rosewood. And at the point where we see rosewood, we're gonna stop. We need to go almost all the way through the body because we need the rosewood to be very thin because the pots are gonna come up through the back and the switch is gonna come up through the back. So we need to make sure that it isn't too thick for the switch to come in and do its thing. You can see we've got just a little bit more to climb down there before we get into the rosewood. So to do that, we're gonna switch to a longer bit. We're getting really close, so we really wanna check our depth here. The router bit looks like it'll just kiss the rosewood right there. We might need to go one more pass deeper than this, but I honestly don't think we're gonna have to. Okay, we are down to the rosewood, which essentially means the thickness we're dealing with is less than that, which will be fine for the switch and be fine for the pots. So this is perfect. So we're gonna stop right here. Now let's make the cover plate. When I made the jig for the pocket, I also created these two templates at the same time. This is all part of one system that fits together. This is the cover plate template. I made it a tiny bit smaller than the cavity for just a little bit of wiggle room because after I put some finish on this, I don't want it to be too tight. This other template fits right down into the bottom of the pocket, and it's gonna help us locate where we drill for the pots, where we put the screws for the switch, and then help us locate the slit that we're gonna use for the little lever arm of the switch to come up through the top of the guitar. So let's make a cover plate. So I'm just sort of trying to align the grain in a way that I think it will look like it blends in. Before I double stick tape this template into place, I'm gonna trace an outline with a white pencil. Just in case something slips, I can get back to where I want it to be. Okay, from here, we're gonna go over the bandsaw and we're just gonna roughly cut this out so there's just a tiny little bit of overhang. Then I'll fine tune it with a router. Feels super smooth to the touch. I think we're all set. 20 minutes of setup for a 2-minute job, but worked out perfectly. It's got just enough wiggle in there. Let's take the template off. I'm gonna make a couple of little marks where the screw holes are gonna get drilled with a drill bit. So it's a 1/4 inch hole, 1/4 inch drill bit. It's a brad point. The brad point will actually put this right in the center. Because this piece of wood is thin and it's quarter sawn, it has a tendency to break. So I'm gonna use a little naphtha to help get the tape unstuck. Okay, I think this looks great. See how that grain line just goes right through the back, right into the cover plate? Again, it's not an absolutely perfect match, but it's pretty close, and I am super pleased with how that turned out. And these are the little marks that we made with the drill bit of where we will locate our screw holes. Before I take this out of here and move to the next step, I'm gonna mark the orientation of this. So I'm just gonna circle my drill holes so I remember what the orientation is. We are going to drill for our pots and the screws for our switch. Okay, let's go over the drill press. Before we drill, I put this board down, and this board is very important because what we don't want to happen is when you drill through, we don't want to get blowout on the other side, which will be the face of the guitar. So we want to be very careful that everything stays nice and crisp. So by putting a lot of downward pressure on the body, when the bit goes through, it'll hold all the wood fibers together. We're gonna locate where the drill bit will go through our template, and then I'm gonna take a 9mm drill bit and drill these holes out, which is just a tiny little bit smaller than the holes. Both these holes came out very clean. Very pleased with how this turned out. And then I'm going to take a 9/64" bit and I'm going to drill for the hole locations for the switch. Okay, all 4 holes are drilled. I'm super pleased with how this turned out. There's no blowout. The holes are really clean. They're all nice and straight. So next we are going to route for the slot where the switch will come through. To put a mark on the top of this of where exactly that will go, I'm going to use a traditional tele cover plate, and I'm going to use a bit just to help me locate it. Put it in the hole, and then roughly line up the other hole. These two line up pretty much dead on perfect. And then I'm going to take a white pencil and reach inside of there. I'm going to make a very distinct white line. Now, if you look at this, you say, hey, your holes don't line up with the traditional tele cover plate. And I did that on purpose. And part of the reason why I did that was, if you played a Telecaster in the past, you know when the switch is all the way over here, it's right on top of that knob. So what I did was I just scooched that knob out just a little bit, brought this one in a little bit just for aesthetics. And so I just slightly customized the position of these electronics. With that done, I am going to take a piece of scrap wood, put a piece of double-sided tape on it, and I'm lightly going to position it as a fence. I'm going to take our plunge router base with a 1/16 of an inch cutter in it, and I'm going to use that to basically cut that slot. So this fence will keep the bit properly aligned right over top of that white mark. So we're going to peel the tape, roughly position it. I kind of did a little pre-work and gave a rough position of that, and then we're going to very closely align it, lock it down, cut our slot. So at this point, we just want to loosely stick this in place because we're going to come back and check it very carefully to make sure it's centered nicely over that white line. And once we got everything where we want it, then we'll lock it down. The light on these plunge router bases is very helpful. When you do this, you want to make sure it doesn't come off that fence. You want to make sure you're putting plenty of pressure back on it so it rides nice and tight against there. Otherwise, it's going to create a problem. Oh, shoot, I bumped it. Okay, don't worry, we'll just keep going. We'll fix this later. So the slot looks good, except for the little part where I bumped the router and took a little notch out of that. So we have to fix that. What I'm going to do is I got a piece of rosewood and a file, and I'm going to make some dust, and I'm going to use that and a little super glue to just fill in that little spot right there. Some people like to make the dust with sandpaper. I prefer not to do that. The sandpaper can leave the little grit in there, and you get these little like white silvery flakes in there. And it looks better if you actually just use a fine file. So I got this file, and we're going to use that to make a little dust. Let's see how that does. I'm just sort of picking out any loose fibers of dust or dirt or anything. Using my razor blade as an edge just to pack that in there as tight as I can get it. And then get rid of everything else that's around, because otherwise you're going to have to sand all that off later. Number 10 super glue, and just really one dot is all it's going to take, maybe two. Like that. Should be about all we need. And I don't want to take this off because if we have a rough edge in there, it might be better to come back with the router bit and just clean that up just a little bit when we're done. And we just need to wait, let that dry, and we'll come back and sand that off. Okay, it's nice and flat. You can see it obviously right there, but I think when we're done cleaning up the slot, it's not going to be much of a problem. You're not going to notice it. So just scrape some of the dust out of here. And then, since we left the fence set up, I'm going to make one more pass on this. And when we're done, this should be all nice and clean again. Okay, so it's not super noticeable. I think it'll be okay in the end. It's kind of a funny story about making mistakes. Every guitar I've ever built has had some level of mistake in them. part of the building process is not just about not making mistakes, but I think it's about learning how to recover from the mistakes when you make them. So, you know, just part of the process. So in the next episode, we're going to drill our holes for the wires for the pickups. We're going to round over the body. We're going to sand everything out, and that's it. We're done. That's going to be the end of the build. So join us for the next episode.